Part 2. We shall now call a second expert, who is, exceptionally, a modern one from the Paris of the 19th century. Charles Baudelaire made Paris spleen unforgettable in the prose poems of his late work. Spleen means the sense of being tired of life, the feeling of the modern individual who cannot imagine living in a different place to that which makes him feel tired of life. Baudelaire's Confession, 1 a.m., is one of the most brilliant descriptions ever written of being weary and yet addicted to the city at the same time. It is a prose poem that circles around the exclamation, "Horrible life, horrible city," a text that was, understandably, Rainer Maria Rilke's favourite piece of writing. I suggest reading it as a modern response to Pindar.
Enfin, seul, on n'entend plus que le roulement de quelques fiacres attardés et éreintés. Pendant quelques heures, nous posséderons le silence, sinon le repos. Enfin, la tyrannie de la face humaine a disparu, et je ne suffirai plus que par moi-même. Enfin, il m'est donc permis de me délaisser dans un bain de ténèbres. D'abord, un double tour à la serrure. Il me semble que ce tour de clef augmentera ma solitude et fortifiera les barricades qui me séparent actuellement du monde. Horrible vie, horrible ville.
Finally, alone. No longer hearing anything but the rumble of a few hackneys delayed and exhausted. For several hours we'll have silence, if not repose. Finally, tyranny of the human face has disappeared, and from now on my sufferings will be my own. Finally I'm allowed to relax, bathed in shadows. First, a double turn of the lock. Turning the key seems to me to increase my solitude and raise the barricade that essentially separates me from the world. Horrible life, horrible city. Baudelaire's protagonist, who has come back to his room from the bustle of the big city, shouts, "Enfin," finally, 3 times. If we take seriously the poet's impatience to put a day in Paris behind him, we can understand what existence in Paris around 1860 meant for the most resolute city dweller. To be tortured by constant contact with people, whose presence is painful because they humiliate whoever cannot deny his likeness to them. By now, the big city has become a stage for a majority of losers, whose mutual communication consists of permanently hurling diffuse insults at each other. None of them really understands what they are doing to each other by being half anonymously in each other's company. They are introduced to each other, only to realise that almost every hand they shake multiplies the number of faces for whom they can't do anything, and who can do nothing for them. For the citizens, the people with ambitions, the people seeking their chance, the city is the place where they vaguely learn that they cannot give each other what they are vaguely looking for. They can only watch each other failing. Wherever they appear, there are beings in action who beg their peers more or less awkwardly for the recognition that their peers cannot give them. The crudest, most vehement, most unsuccessful of these seekers for recognition even forget what they are begging for, and their nastiness can burst out like a force of nature in the middle of the commercial quarter. This is how the refined metropolis comes to resemble the primeval forest. What the poet in his soul-searching feels washing over him are examples of both things. People begging for recognition, and his own murky game in dealing equally with these ladies and gentlemen and monsters. After a day like this, the man in the city has entirely earned his self-loathing. Somebody who loathes himself, or herself, believes, of course, that truth still exists, even in the big city. Perhaps the last Catholic illusion. For the sake of this truth, the poet goes to his room like a sinner to the confessional box, and like a revolutionary taking up position behind the barricade. By confessing, he proves that people are right to rebel, and it is indeed the barricade to which modern literature owes a radiant scene. A day in a big city is recalled before the last pang of conscience. Horrible life, horrible city. Let's go over my day. Having seen some men of letters, one of whom asked me, "Can you go to Russia by land?" apparently assuming that Russia is an island, argued at length with the director of a review who, to each of my objections, replied, "We're all gentlemen here," as if to say that every other paper is put out by rogues. Greeted a couple dozen people, 3/4 of whom I didn't know, shook hands with a like number without the precaution of gloves. During a rain, to kill time, went to see a lady tumbler who wanted me to design a costume for Venustra. Paid court to a theatre director who, dismissing me, said, "You might do better consulting with ZZ, dullest, stupidest, and most famous of my authors. The two of you might come up with something. Go see him and we'll talk about it." Bragged, why, about several nasty things I hadn't done, and denied in cowardly fashion some misdeeds in which I had luxuriated. Flagrant braggadocio, offences to human dignity. Refused a friend an easy favour and wrote a recommendation for a perfect skunk. Ugh, can that be all? One could introduce apolitology, negative political theory, as a discipline, and explain it in terms of the demand for a political theory to match this passage of prose and the consciousness it exhibits. The poet presents himself clearly as a creature with a double life, who seeks his chance by day in the big city theatre of ambitions, and becomes his own audience at night with the ability to see himself as a witness and as somebody with a conscience. This is the primal scene of negative political theory. If the citizen cannot completely anaesthetize himself in the urban business, but instead retains the ability, regardless of its origin, to take a rather eccentric view of himself playing the role of a citizen, then this observer is already the quintessential non-citizen. Anybody who watches other urban dwellers going about their business remains an urban dweller himself, doing a typically urban activity, being a spectator. People who see themselves being carried along by the hustle and bustle of the city transcend the city and become transcendent witnesses, to some extent, without a city. In Baudelaire's account, the apolitical witness had a double definition, through Catholicism and through art religion. The Catholics brought the monk with them into the big city, and the artists brought the Satanist, the melancholy extraterrestrial creature who lives the life of a fallen angel of the city. The voices of these two non-urban figures are united in the final lines of Baudelaire's prose poem to form a strange bedtime prayer.
Mécontent de tous et mécontent de moi, je voudrais bien me racheter et m'engueuler un peu dans le silence et la solitude de la nuit. Aime de ce que j'aimais, aime de ce que j'ai chanté, fortifiez-moi, soutenez-moi, éloignez de moi les mensonges et les vapeurs corruptrices du monde. Et vous, Seigneur mon Dieu, accordez-moi la grâce de produire quelques beaux vers qui me prouvent à moi-même que je ne suis pas le dernier des hommes, que je ne suis pas inférieur à ce que je méprise.
Annoyed by everyone and annoyed with myself, I'd like to be redeemed and gain a little self-respect in the silence and solitude of the night. Souls of those I've loved, the souls of those I've sung, strengthen me, sustain me. Take from me the world's lies and breath of corruption. And you, Lord God, accord me the grace to produce a few beautiful lines, enough to prove to myself that I am not the worst of men, that I am not beneath even those for whom I have such contempt. It doesn't matter whether we try to devalue these lines by attributing them to a hysterical Catholic, or whether we hail them as paradigms by reading them as a typical statement of modern urban individualism. It is easy enough to have been exposed to the gravity of this scene, whatever the literary distortions, to see that it differs from classical political studies in its approach to the question of individuals' ability to belong to their cities and communities. This urban bedtime prayer implies that towering over one's own city should be seen as a fundamentally serious issue. The non-citizen as the interior double of the citizen is a challenge to phenomenological recognition. Non-city dwellers, non-citizenry, non-polity, these are factors that finally raise categorical demands, even if it displeases political positivists. The city dweller does not live from the city alone, whereas the city, in turn, in its most brilliant guise, lives from the people who transcend it.